Now, you might find that if you try to talk about grieving your childlessness, someone might helpfully say, but you can't be grieving anything. You haven't actually lost anything. Doesn't feel like that to us, because what we've lost of is not just the dream of motherhood, but the whole life we had planned for ourselves and the children that live only in our heart. And it's not just that we won't have a baby. We won't take them to school. We won't take those first day at school photos. We won't, have children alongside our siblings. We won't be the mother of our partner's children and hold that precious place in their heart. We won't watch them grow up and maybe get partnered and have their own children. And then as we get old, there'll be no one from the younger generation around us to support us with that process. And when we die, our line dies with us. So actually, I think I have lost quite a lot. Thank you for your unasked for advice. Now, one of the reasons it's so difficult to identify this as a form of grief is that childlessness is a form of disenfranchised grief. Now, disenfranchised grief is a bit of a mouthful, but effectively what it is it's a form of grief that is not socially validated, that is not socially acceptable. We're not allowed to feel it. We're not meant to talk about it. And quite crucially, we're not allowed to ask for support with it or expect empathy for it. Yeah, I know. It isn't the only form of grief or sort of event that exists under disenfranchised grief. It was actually first named by the Professor Kenneth Doka back in the 80s through his work looking at how some forms of grief, like when an ex-partner dies, you're sort of not allowed to feel grief for it, because people will say, but you split up with them years ago, or you divorced them years ago. Why are you upset about it now? It's like, you're not allowed to feel grief for that. I mean, I don't know how we decided what we're allowed to feel grief with and not, but there's sort of like social rules. And that one, another one, terribly, is actually sibling loss. People often don't really understand how devastating it can be to lose a sibling, and may always say to that sibling, how's your mum doing? Like, what am I, chopped liver? And that can be really hard for the sibling who's surviving to really talk about and get empathy for what it's like for them to grieve their sister. Even to some extent, even a really good friend. It's like there are people after a while be like, really, you're still missing your friend? So there's lots of forms, but childlessness, it is a lifelong living loss. You will be childless forever. So the loss impacts you across the life course. Sometimes describing it as a lifelong living loss to people can maybe help them lean in and go, oh, whereas disenfranchised grief, it just can sound really technical. But this is why it's really important to understand that you're grieving, because it's unlikely that anyone will tell you. No one told me. It wasn't until I was doing a course on bereavement as part of my psychotherapy training that I realized that what I was learning felt very familiar. And I went home that night and I kind of mapped out what I was learning about this grief model against my experience of childlessness. And I went, wow, I'm grieving. And a lot of people still discover that they're grieving through my work, through the hundreds of podcasts and media interviews I've given over the last decade. And the therapeutic profession hasn't really caught up with it yet. So, I was in therapy at the time and I was working really hard on my childlessness. Nobody ever named the complicated experience I was having around it as grief. As soon as I knew it was grief, I kind of went headlong I became a bit of a grief junkie. I learned everything I could about it. And that's how I learned about disenfranchised grief. Now, it is really good to know that you're grieving, because it can normalize some of the crazy making thoughts and feelings. Because anyone who has experienced grief, and if this is your first irrevocable loss, it can be really surprising for you, but many of us have already had experiences with profound grief in our life, and so may recognize the really, really weird internal world of grief that is half logical and half fantasy, and where lots of things that don't seem to be connected to our loss get impacted by it. For example, not being able to read. It's a really, really common experience when you're grieving. You know, it's like, I'm a great reader. I've always been a great reader. I couldn't take in information anymore, particularly fiction. I also couldn't watch films. And it wasn't the content of the films. It was like, I think my brain was working so hard on constructing a new identity for me. It was such a creative process, grief. I just didn't have the space to kind of mentally imagine someone else's story. Non-fiction I could cope with, and a lot of people find audio a lot easier to deal with. But one of the things that's really hard is that a lot of things that used to bring me joy didn't bring me joy anymore. So I couldn't even sort of distract myself with things that used to work. You know, I kind of go to the swimming pool and I wouldn't even get any further than the changing rooms before I just couldn't cope with it all, you know, and I just, you know, go and sit in the cafe and have a hot chocolate and a bag of crisps and go home again. In fact, the worst of my grief, I think if I wrote an autobiography of those years, I would just call them the carbohydrate years, because really red wine and chocolate was pretty much the only pleasures that seemed to be left in life for me at that point. You know, bicycle, you know, riding my bike around London, all the things, just simple, the simple pleasure of being alive wasn't there for a long time. And that was really scary. And it wasn't really depression. It was something else. So that the grief model that I work with, it's not perfect because it's a model and human beings aren't models. We're all different. Is called the 5 Stages of Grief Model, and it comes from the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. You can find out more about it in my book. In a way, it doesn't really matter which grief model you use. They're all imperfect, and each of us is going to experience our grief in our own way, because actually grief is a form of love. And you think, what? It's kind of the shadow side of love, because what creates grief is love. Is we only grieve something if we loved it. And if that thing or that identity or that dream is no longer in our lives and we're grieving it, it means we loved it. I think when I worked that out for myself, it kind of gave me permission to realize how much I loved those children that only lived in my heart, you know, how much they meant to me. And that was really important for me, because I think it also allowed me to really feel my grief, because it was something I could do for them in a way. It was like, this was their gift to me, was this grief, because this grief was what was going to get me through the experience of not having them in my life. And so for me, understanding it was a form of love was very important. And it was almost like a love that had no place to go. It's like this incredible desire in me to love my children, to parent them, to bring them up, to keep them safe, to teach them about the world. What am I going to do with that feeling? And actually, what I had to do with that feeling was use it to help me with my grieving process, which is a very creative process. And it didn't mean I had to let go of, give up, let go, or get over that love. I think this is something that is really important to know. The love I have for my children is still in me. It's still in my heart. It can still be touched. It just no longer devastates me. It's like my heart was broken by my childlessness, but it has healed bigger. And so now that love for my children is like nestled like a jewel right in the middle of my heart. And it will be with me until the day I die. And that's okay. They're in a safe place inside me. But that the pain of them no longer is the most daily experience of my life, that it's been integrated into that. So the 5 stages of grief sounds great, doesn't it? It's often called the DABDA model, DABDA, which stands for denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. I remember someone once said to me, oh, that's great. So, you know, grief has 5 stages. So I'll be kind of done in 5 weeks. And I went, that would be brilliant, but it's not how it works. It also doesn't work in order. You also move around them. I think I mean, Kubler-Ross was really angry that her work had been seen as kind of like 5 steps. These are experiences within grief, and they're more of a spiral. And you can be in acceptance about one part of your loss. You can be furious as hell about another part. You can be really low and angry. You can also be in denial about, parts of it. All of that is perfectly normal. In my book, I walk you through the 5 stages, what you can experience in each of those stages, likely things that can happen. And I also give you some ideas of what is called grief work. Now, that sounds like a fun assignment, I know. But the thing is, it's actually, grief work isn't always, just like sitting around crying, which is what maybe we might imagine. It's also might be about finding creative ways to express your grief. It might be about engaging with a creative practice again. It might be about mindfulness. It might be about exercise. It might be about journaling. It might be about meeting other childless. There are lots and lots of things. It might be about listening to music that makes you cry. It might be about creating a memorial for the children that you'll never meet. It could be about doing a ritual, planting a tree. I have many members over the years who've done these rituals with me. And when they finish the ritual, they've kind of torn up the paper and buried it in the ground and planted, a tree. And someone told me recently that there is a rose that blooms on the tree in her garden every year on a significant anniversary for her loss. And it blooms on that day. And it has done now so for many years. Our relationship with our children and the natural world is something really extraordinary. So we'll be providing you with a kind of a cheat sheet on some of the grief work, but I do recommend that you read the grief chapter. Now, I started talking about grief as a process of identity transformation. Grief is actually kind of the engine of change, because what grief is the human, emotional, psychological, and physical experience that enables us to become the person who can live and thrive in life without that thing that we thought we couldn't live without. And the fact is, that's actually a different person to who you are today. You are becoming a new version of yourself. That's what I mean by identity transformation. Probably for many of us, the last time we had an identity transformation this profound was adolescence. So I would also encourage you to take really good care of yourself in grief. It is absolutely exhausting. So if you need to kind of take it slow, it has its own speed. Because grief is a form of love. You can't make yourself love someone. You can't make yourself love something. It is something that comes from a deeper place in us than our ego. Grief is part of love. So the process of grief kind of has its own engine and speed and logic, which is often not very logical, because love is often not very logical. Why do we love this person and not that person? It's beyond our kind of rational control. So I would really encourage yourself to engage in grief as a much more sort of fluid, extraordinary, spiritual, if that word resonates with you, deep human experience. I think for me, one of the things that really helped me when I first started doing a deep dive into grief was understanding that it was part of the human experience. That when I look back in literature to the ancient Greeks, to the Vedic text, to ancient Chinese literature, people have been writing about grief for as long as we have been able to read people's writings. It is part of what it means to be human. And I would just encourage you to be really gentle with yourself and know that in order to get to your plan B, this idea of this new person you're going to be, you can't really jump there. You can't really just start a new career or move to another country or just become this person who's okay with their childlessness. It's actually grief that will get you there. And I talk about in my book some of the shortcuts we might try to take to get to our plan B and why that might not work for you. We don't have time to get into that here, but just so you know, grief is not out to get you, even though it might feel like it. It's actually out to heal you. Sometimes what we need to learn is how to support ourselves in that process and how to get support from others. Because a really important thing about grief is a dialogue, not a monologue. It has to be done in community. That can be an online community, that can be with a therapist, that can be with a group of other childless women, but it has to be with people who completely understand what we're going through. Like love cannot exist on its own, it has to have the beloved. Grief cannot exist on its own. It has to have other grievers to accompany us on our journey. You know, our culture has become one where we tend to do things on our own, in our heads. It doesn't work. You're going to need your people in order to do your grief work.